The smell of old fries and stale coffee hung in the air as Luke Parker pushed open the rusty door of the little roadside diner. It was the kind of place where the menu never changed and the servers' smiles were as worn out as the red vinyl seats. But for Luke, right now, it was the best he could offer his daughter. Sophie, with her messy blonde hair and faded blue dress, clung tightly to his hand. She was only 5, but already carried in her brown eyes a kind of maturity Luke knew all too well, the kind you get when you lose too much too soon. He squeezed her hand gently, trying to push away the guilt gnawing at him. "Let's grab a table by the window, sweetheart," he suggested, forcing a smile. Sophie nodded, her big, alert eyes scanning the place. The diner was almost empty, just an elderly couple in one corner and a woman sitting alone at another table, absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone. Luke helped Sophie settle in and grabbed the laminated menu. Cheap burgers, greasy pancakes, milkshakes that seemed more sugar than milk. It wasn't much, but it would do. While Luke debated whether he had enough money to get something besides a kid's meal, Sophie froze, staring at the woman sitting just a few feet away. Before Luke could ask what was wrong, Sophie slipped off her chair, crossed the diner in determined little steps, and to Luke's horror, ran straight to the woman. "Mommy!" Sophie cried out, throwing herself into the stranger's arms. The diner went dead silent. Luke jumped from his chair, heart pounding like crazy, already preparing to apologize, to pull Sophie away before the woman called the cops or started yelling at them. But the woman didn't push Sophie away. Instead, she froze, her eyes wide open, staring at the little girl like she'd seen a ghost. "Sophie," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. Luke rushed over, breathless, ready to explain the mix-up. But when he looked into the woman's eyes as blue as a summer sky, something inside him stopped cold. He knew those eyes. He dreamed about those eyes, because those were the eyes of the woman he thought he had lost forever. Lauren Bennett. The woman who, 3 years ago, had vanished from his life without a trace. The woman he had loved more than life itself. The woman everyone said was gone for good. And there she was, in the flesh, holding Sophie like the whole world was falling apart around them. "Lauren?" Luke whispered, his voice breaking. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and just nodded, like any word would fall way too short to explain. And that's when everything changed. Because tucked into the pocket of Lauren's bag, between crumpled papers and forgotten receipts, the golden seal of a billionaire inheritance quietly gleamed. A secret that was about to come to light and change Luke's, Sophie's, and Lauren's lives forever. But right then, under the diner's flickering lights and the strong smell of old grease, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that she was back, and nothing would ever be the same again. Luke could barely breathe as he watched Lauren hold Sophie close to her chest. For a second, the scene felt impossible, like a dream he was scared would vanish if he dared to blink. Sophie, innocent and full of trust, smiled at Lauren like she had just found the missing piece of her life's puzzle. Lauren finally let go of Sophie, crouching down to meet her at eye level. She stroked the girl's golden hair with a tenderness so deep, Luke felt a sharp ache in his chest. "You've grown so much," Lauren murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Sophie smiled, not understanding the weight of those words. "I remember you," she said, touching Lauren's face with her tiny fingers. "I knew you'd come back." Tears shimmered in Lauren's eyes. Luke took a step forward, the instinct to protect his daughter still strong. "Lauren," he started, his voice hoarse. "Where have you been?" She straightened up slowly, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. For a moment, it looked like she might collapse right there, but then she took a deep breath, digging for strength somewhere deep inside. "Luke, I know I owe you an explanation," she said, looking at him with painful sincerity, "but not here, not now." He frowned, torn between anger and confusion. 3 years of unanswered questions, 3 years of raising a daughter alone, 3 years of blaming himself for everything that had happened. And now she was standing there, talking like words could just patch it all up. Still, Sophie was holding Lauren's hand with so much trust, so much hope, that Luke didn't have the heart to tear them apart. "Got a better place?" Luke asked, his voice low and controlled. Lauren glanced around, The cheap diner, the flickering fluorescent lights, the curious stares from the few customers. She nodded. "I'm staying at a hotel nearby," she said. "It's simple, but it's private." Luke hesitated. Every instinct in his body screamed to protect them, to not trust so easily. But the look in Sophie's eyes, the way she rested her head against Lauren's arm like she already knew they belonged together, was what made him decide. He ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "All right, let's go." Lauren gave a timid smile, like she was scared any sudden move might shatter the fragile moment. She led them to her car, a discreet silver sedan, and Sophie happily climbed into the back seat, chatting away like there weren't 3 years of missing time between them. Luke, on the other hand, kept his gaze sharp and wary, every fiber of him on high alert. The hotel was a small, run-down place on the side of the highway, with a worn-out facade and a neon vacancy sign blinking tiredly. It wasn't the kind of place happy stories usually began. But maybe, Luke thought, it didn't matter where it started. What mattered was where it could go from here. They climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor, where Lauren unlocked a simple room with 2 beds and a window that squeaked in the night breeze. Sophie ran to the window, peeking out at the distant city lights, while Luke and Lauren stood near the door, a heavy silence hanging between them. Finally, Lauren broke the ice. "I never wanted to leave you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Luke crossed his arms, hardening himself. "Then why did you, Lauren? Why'd you leave us alone?" She closed her eyes for a moment, like the words physically hurt her. "Because I didn't have a choice," she said. And right there, in that vague answer, Luke knew. There was way more to this story than he could even imagine. And if he looked closely, he could see it in Lauren's eyes. The secret she carried wasn't just about pain or regret. It was about something much bigger, something that could change everything, and he needed to decide if he was ready to hear it. Luke stayed frozen at the door, his body tense like he was ready to either bolt or fight. For 3 years, he had imagined this reunion, but in his worst nightmares, not his dreams. Because deep down, he knew a disappearance like Lauren's never came without consequences. Sophie jumped on the bed, laughing, oblivious to the tension thick in the room. The innocent sound of her laughter cut through the heavy air, reminding Luke of who he had to protect, no matter what was about to be revealed that night. Lauren sat on the edge of the other bed, rubbing her worn jeans. Her eyes stayed downcast, avoiding his. "You have to understand," she started, her voice trembling. "I did what I thought was right at the time." Luke scoffed, disbelief written all over his face. "Right? Disappearing without a word? Without a note? Without a damn explanation?" Lauren bit her lower lip, fighting back tears. "If I had stayed, you and Sophie would have been in danger." Those words made Luke's world screech to a halt for a second. "Danger?" he repeated, his voice a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Danger from who, Lauren?" She looked up then. And what Luke saw in her eyes wasn't just fear, it was terror, an old, deep kind of terror, like someone who had spent way too many nights looking over their shoulder. "My father," she said quietly. Luke blinked, trying to fit that piece into the image he had of old Richard Bennett. A rich, cold man, the kind who could buy half the state if he wanted. A tycoon used to controlling everything and everyone around him. "Your father?" Luke repeated, stepping forward. "What's he got to do with this?" Lauren took a deep breath, like she needed to gather every ounce of courage she had to go on. "When I got pregnant with Sophie, he lost it. Said a child out of wedlock, with a common guy like you, would ruin the family's image. He wanted me to get rid of you both." Luke felt his stomach turn. "When I refused, he threatened me," Lauren went on, her voice breaking. "He said he'd do anything to protect the family's reputation. I didn't believe him, until I started being followed, until I got anonymous calls, until they found my best friend, dead in an accident that made no sense." Luke clenched his fists, fighting the anger boiling inside him. "So you ran," he said, the bitter, painful realization finally hitting. Lauren nodded. "I thought if I disappeared, if I cut all ties, they'd forget about you two." She ran her hand over her face, frustrated. "But I never stopped thinking about you, Not for a single day. Luke stepped away, crossing the small space to the window, staring out into the darkness. He needed air. He needed to think. Behind him, Sophie's sweet little voice broke the tension. "Daddy, I'm sleepy." He turned, meeting his daughter's innocent gaze, completely unaware of the heavy storm swirling around them. "All right, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "Lie down for a bit, okay?" Sophie nodded and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Lauren looked at Luke, her face a mix of pain and hope. "Luke," she said, almost a whisper, "I didn't just come back to see you. I came back because something changed." He raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "My father died 2 months ago." The words hung heavy in the air, thick with meaning. "And with him," Lauren continued, "the secret he was keeping died too." Luke turned fully toward her, his heart pounding. "What secret?" Lauren bit her lip, hesitating. "I'm heir to everything. The fortune, the land, the businesses. Everything." Luke blinked, stunned. "And Sophie too," Lauren whispered. That hot summer night, in a cheap motel room in the middle of nowhere, Luke realized that his life, Sophie's life, was about to change forever. And Lauren's past, though buried, was far from at peace. Luke stood frozen, like Lauren's words had knocked the ground right out from under him. Heir, fortune, everything. It felt like he had just been thrown into a world he didn't belong to. A world where Sophie, his little girl, was suddenly part of something way bigger than anything he had ever dreamed of. Lauren shifted uncomfortably on the bed, watching the storm of emotions play across his face. "I know it's a lot," she said, her voice cautious. I can barely believe it myself." Luke ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm the whirlwind inside his mind. "So you disappear for 3 years?" he said, every word dripping with bitterness. "And when you come back, it's to tell me my daughter's, what? A lost billionaire princess?" Lauren bit her lip, the pain clear in her eyes. "That's not how I wanted it to happen." "No?" Luke let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "Because it sure as hell feels like it." Sophie stirred in the bed, mumbling in her sleep, and both of them instinctively lowered their voices, as if any loud word might break the fragile bubble still protecting them. Lauren looked at the small, sleeping figure, and her expression softened. "I came back for her, Luke," she whispered. "And for you, too. I never stopped loving you." The words fell heavy in the room. Luke closed his eyes, feeling an old anger bubbling under his skin. He wanted to yell, wanted to say that love wasn't disappearing into the night, wasn't leaving them alone to face the world. But he also knew, deep down, that Lauren wasn't lying. The pain in her eyes was real. The regret, tangible. "So what happens now?" Luke asked, his voice rough. Lauren hesitated. Now we have to decide," she said, and the weight of her words filled the air. "If we're going to face this together." Luke turned to the window, staring at nothing. What did he know about billionaire inheritances, about lawyers, companies, the media? He was just a regular guy, trying to keep his daughter alive one day at a time. But Sophie wasn't just a regular little girl anymore. And Lauren wasn't just the woman he loved. "You really think we can just go back to what we were?" Luke asked, not looking at her. Lauren stood up, crossing the small space between them, and laid a timid hand on his arm. "I don't want us to go back to what we were," she said softly. "I want us to be something new, something stronger." Luke turned to her then, their eyes meeting in a silent clash of emotions. He saw the fear there, the fear that he would reject her, that he'd say it was too late. But he also saw the hope, that fragile, desperate kind of hope that only exists when you've lost everything and still choose to believe. "Lauren," he began, his voice cracking. But before he could say anything more, there was a knock at the door. 3 sharp, impatient knocks. Lauren went pale instantly, stepping back on instinct. Luke frowned, every protective instinct flaring to life. He stepped toward the door. "Stay behind me," he murmured to Lauren. She obeyed without a word. Luke peeked through the peephole, and what he saw made the blood freeze in his veins. Standing outside were 2 men in black suits, with hard expressions and dark sunglasses. They didn't look like pizza delivery guys. Luke knew, deep down, that Lauren's past hadn't stayed buried as easily as she had wanted to believe. And that billionaire's secret came with a price way higher than just money. Luke kept his eye glued to the peephole for another second, studying the two men outside. They looked completely out of place in that cheap motel, like wolves disguised in a land of lambs. The suits were too expensive, the shoes too polished, and the impatience radiating off them was almost physical. Luke turned to Lauren, his heart pounding. "Are you expecting anyone?" he whispered. Lauren shook her head, her eyes wide. "No one." The knocks came again, louder this time. "Lauren Bennett?" called a voice from the other side, formal and cold. Luke didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for Lauren and Sophie to move away from the door. Sophie, still sleepy, mumbled in protest, but Luke gently pulled her to the farthest corner of the room. "Who is it?" Luke finally asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Private security from Bennett Corporation," the man replied. "We're here at the request of Mr. Miles Crawford, executor of the estate." Lauren paled even more, her hand trembling as she covered her mouth. Luke frowned. "Who's Miles Crawford?" Lauren whispered, her voice shaking. "He was my father's personal lawyer. If he sent security, it's not for my benefit." Luke understood immediately. This wasn't a courtesy visit. They were here to make sure of something, and he seriously doubted it was a friendly chat. Options raced through his mind. Open the door? Run out the window? Wait? Instinct kicked in. "Got a warrant?" Luke called out, raising his voice. There was a brief pause outside. "We're only here to escort Ms. Bennett to the main office," the man said, but the lack of a direct answer was all Luke needed to hear. He looked at Lauren. "Grab your stuff," he said, low and urgent. "Now!" She didn't hesitate. In seconds, Lauren grabbed her bag and pulled Sophie by the hand. Sophie, still half asleep, obeyed without question. Luke scanned the room, searching for an escape route. The window. It was narrow, but it opened to the side street, and with any luck, the sound of rain starting to fall would cover their escape. He carefully slid the window open, the squeak loud enough to make him grit his teeth. "Go," he muttered to Lauren, helping her through first. She slipped out, landing softly on the wet grass. Sophie was next, with Luke lifting her and handing her off to Lauren's waiting arms. Before following them, Luke cast one last look at the door, where the knocks had now turned into furious pounding. "Lauren Bennett, open this door immediately." Luke didn't wait to see if they'd break it down. He jumped through the window, landing hard beside Lauren and Sophie. Without wasting a second, he grabbed them both and ran toward the empty parking lot, where his old pickup truck sat under the light drizzle. They scrambled inside, Luke firing up the engine with trembling fingers. The motor coughed, sputtered, but finally roared to life. The two men burst through the motel door, yelling and sprinting toward them. "Hold on!" Luke shouted, slamming his foot on the gas. The truck fish-tailed in the mud, the tires spinning before finally catching and shooting forward down the wet road. In the back seat, Sophie clutched a teddy bear to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. Lauren turned to her daughter, trying to smile despite the terror written all over her face. Luke didn't look back. He knew that night would change everything, that this escape wasn't the end, it was only the beginning, and that the billionaire secret Lauren carried was way more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. The old pickup rattled under the steady rain as Luke pushed down the deserted highway, his eyes locked on the gleaming asphalt ahead. Every headlight appearing in the distance made his muscles tighten, bracing for the worst. In the passenger seat, Lauren held Sophie close, whispering soothing words that sounded more like they were meant for herself than for her daughter. Sophie, brave despite the confusion, rested her head on her mother's lap and closed her eyes. The silence between Luke and Lauren was thick, sharp, full of everything they wanted to say but couldn't yet. Finally, when the town was far behind them and all around was nothing but darkness and open fields, Luke spoke without taking his eyes off the road. "You should have told me," he said, his voice low but loaded with hurt. "From the beginning." Lauren closed her eyes for a second, her chest tightening. "I know." Luke gripped the wheel tighter. "You didn't have the right to decide that alone, Lauren. Sophie's my daughter too. The pain in his words was raw. Lauren looked at him, her eyes filled with regret. I thought I was protecting you. I thought disappearing was the only way to keep you safe. Luke let out a bitter laugh. And now? You think this is over? You think those men are just going to leave us alone because you came back? Lauren lowered her head. No, she whispered. I know they won't. The rain drummed on the roof of the truck, filling the heavy silence. Luke exhaled harshly. So what do we do now? Lauren looked at him, fear and determination mixed on her face. I have a house, she said. About 2 hours from here. Nobody knows I'm back there. It's isolated, safe. Luke glanced at her, weighing every word, every move. He wanted to trust her, part of him, the part that still remembered the girl he once loved, desperately wanted to believe. But there was another part, the part that spent 3 years staring at an empty chair at the dinner table, that couldn't forget so easily. If I go with you, he said slowly, it's on my terms. Lauren nodded, relieved he was even considering it. You're going to tell me everything, Luke continued. No more secrets, no more lies, and most of all, no disappearing again. Lauren bit her lip, fighting back emotion. I promise, she said, her voice trembling. I swear. Luke wanted to believe her, for Sophie, for whatever they could still be, if they had a chance. He veered the truck off the main road, taking a shortcut only locals knew about. The rain thickened, blurring the muddy road even more. It's gonna be a long night, Luke muttered, more to himself than to her. Lauren pulled Sophie closer, and the movement, so protective, so instinctive, made Luke's chest tighten. They looked like a family. But he knew, real families were built on trust, and trusting Lauren again would be the biggest leap of faith he'd ever take. As the engine rumbled and the darkness swallowed them whole, Luke could only pray he wasn't making the biggest mistake of his life. The dirt road stretched ahead of them like a muddy snake, lit only by the flickering headlights of the truck. The rain had eased up, but the air was still thick with the smell of wet earth and looming danger. Sophie slept soundly in Lauren's lap, one tiny arm flung out in total trust, like she was home, safe. Luke stole a glance away from the road, watching the scene. Something tightened inside him, a feeling that, despite everything, there was still a bond there. Something time and distance hadn't managed to break. Lauren noticed his look and offered a timid smile, a smile that, years ago, would have melted any resistance he had. But now, it was different. How much farther? Luke asked, turning his attention back to the road. Less than half an hour, Lauren said, adjusting Sophie carefully. The house is at the end of a private lane, right in the middle of the woods. My grandfather bought it when he was young. Hardly anyone even knows it's there. Luke nodded, his jaw tight. Isolation. Normally it would be an advantage. Fewer people, fewer eyes. But it also meant if anything went wrong, they'd be completely on their own. The truck jolted as he made a sharp turn onto an even narrower trail, almost swallowed by the overgrown trees. For a few minutes, only the sound of tires squishing through the mud and the steady thrum of the engine filled the silence. Then Lauren spoke, her voice low, almost like she was confessing something forbidden. When I was gone, I used to dream about this. Luke frowned but didn't say anything, letting her continue. I used to dream about it, about coming back, about seeing you, about being forgiven. She gave a sad smile, but most of the time in those dreams, you wouldn't even let me get close. Luke swallowed hard, because if he was honest, part of him was still stuck in that dream, struggling to decide whether or not to let his guard down. Dreams don't always tell the truth, he muttered. Lauren looked at him, surprised by the small concession. Before she could answer, the truck's headlights lit up a wooden structure nestled among the trees. A modest 2-story house hidden under the thick canopy. The windows were shuttered, the porch covered in dry leaves, but still, there was something comforting about the sight. This is it, Lauren said, her voice thick with emotion. Luke parked the truck as close to the entrance as possible. He shut off the engine, and the world plunged into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant dripping of water from the trees. Stay in the truck, he ordered softly to Lauren and Sophie. Without waiting for a response, Luke climbed out, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Old habits died hard. He'd learned long ago never to trust appearances. The house looked deserted, but real safety meant checking every door, every window, every shadow. He circled the house, alert for any signs of intrusion. Footprints, broken windows, forced doors. Nothing. When he finished, he returned to the truck, where Lauren waited with Sophie still sleeping in her arms. "It's clear," he said. "Let's go." Lauren nodded, relieved, and together they crossed the creaky porch to the front door. Lauren fumbled in her jacket pocket and found an old brass key. The door groaned loudly as it swung open, revealing the dusty but welcoming interior of the house. Lauren led them inside, flicking on the light in the main room. The room was simple. A worn sofa, a cold fireplace, shelves crammed with old books. Luke closed the door behind them and locked it, instinctively checking the lock twice. Sophie mumbled something in her sleep, snuggling closer to her mother's neck. "There's a bedroom upstairs," Lauren said with a tired smile. "She'll sleep better there." Luke watched as Lauren carried Sophie up the stairs, each step seeming heavier than the last. He stood there for a moment, alone in the old room, listening to the soft sounds of the house, the creaking wood, the wind against the windows. And for the first time since Lauren had reappeared, he allowed the reality to truly settle in. They were together again. But so was the danger. And trusting her again would be like stepping onto thin ice, a risk that could very easily break everything. Luke stayed in the living room for a long time after Lauren and Sophie went upstairs. The soft creaking of the old house and the faint whisper of the wind slipping through the cracks kept him on edge, as if danger could burst through at any moment. Finally, he sighed, shrugged off his wet jacket, and draped it over the back of the old armchair. There were some old ashes in the fireplace. He grabbed a few sticks stacked in a nearby basket and lit a fire. The flames sputtered at first, but soon filled the room with a comforting warmth. He sat down, letting the heat ease the tension in his sore muscles. But his mind wouldn't slow down. Soft footsteps sounded on the stairs, and he looked up. Lauren was coming down, her hair loose, wearing an oversized t-shirt and sweatpants, so different from the woman he'd seen at the diner earlier that night. She looked vulnerable, real. She hesitated when she saw him, but then slowly crossed the room and sat on the opposite couch, pulling her knees up to her chest. "She's asleep," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke nodded, saying nothing. For a few minutes, only the crackle of the fire filled the silence. Finally, Lauren spoke, her voice filled with a nervousness she couldn't quite hide. "Thank you, Luke." He raised an eyebrow, suspicious. "For not leaving me behind," she explained, staring into the fire. "You would have had every right to." Luke let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think it's that easy?" he asked. "That I could just leave you behind?" Lauren turned to him, her blue eyes shining under the faint light of the fireplace. "After everything I did," she murmured. Luke shook his head slowly. "You don't get it, Lauren. I loved you. For real. No matter what happened, you were never easy to erase." The words slipped out before he could stop them, raw and true. Lauren bit her lip, fighting back emotion. "I loved you too," she said, barely audible. "I still do." The silence that followed was so heavy it almost felt solid. Luke leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That doesn't erase what happened," he said, his voice rough. "It doesn't erase the years Sophie spent asking why she didn't have a mom like the other kids. It doesn't erase the emptiness." Lauren closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I know," she whispered. Luke rubbed his face with his hands, trying to push away the pain threatening to choke him. "I don't know if I can trust you again," he said honestly. Lauren nodded, taking the blow without defending herself. "I'm not asking you to trust me," she said. "I'm just asking you to let me try." Luke looked at her, studying every line of the face he knew so well, but that now seemed so different, so worn by life. And for the first time in a long time, he wanted to believe. He wanted to give them, a second chance. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting soft shadows along the walls. Luke stood up, walking to the window and peeking into the darkness outside. No movement, no sign of the men in black. Still, he knew. Danger hadn't gone away. It had just stepped back, waiting for the next move. He turned to Lauren. "We're doing this right this time," he said, his voice firm with decision. Lauren looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes. "You, me, Sophie? If we're gonna fight for this, we do it together." She nodded, a shy smile tugging at her lips. Luke walked back to the couch and sat down beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. For the first time that night, the fear that had wrapped around them gave way to something else. Something that felt a lot like hope. They sat there side by side, watching the fire dance, two broken pieces trying to find a way to fit back together again. And deep down, Luke knew this would be the most important fight of their lives. Morning came gray and silent, the scent of wet earth still hanging in the air. Last night's storm had left its marks, leaves scattered across the porch, broken branches covering part of the path to the road. Luke woke up early, as always, his body too used to never fully relaxing. He found Lauren in the kitchen, wearing an old floral apron and struggling, with little success, to light the ancient stove. "This thing's got a mind of its own," she said, frustrated, as she lightly smacked the ignition button. Luke walked over without a word, crouched down, made a few quick adjustments, and, with a spark and a whoosh, the flame came to life. Lauren raised her eyebrows, impressed. "Wow. And here I thought you only knew how to fix old trucks." Luke gave a sideways grin, the first genuine smile in a long time. "Picked up a few skills over the years." Lauren smiled too, a smile that lit up her face in a way that made Luke's chest tighten. For a moment, they stood there, so close they could feel each other's warmth. But before anything else could happen, dragging footsteps echoed down the stairs. Sophie appeared, her hair a messy halo, dragging her teddy bear across the floor. "Morning, Angel," Lauren said, opening her arms. Sophie ran straight into her, burying her face in her mother's lap like she'd never been away. Luke watched the scene, his heart warming and aching at the same time. After a simple breakfast, burnt pancakes and lukewarm milk, Lauren suggested they take a walk around the property. "There's a clearing nearby that my grandpa loved," she said, her eyes sparkling. "I want to show it to Sophie." Luke hesitated, his protective instincts kicking in, but the joy in Sophie's eyes disarmed him. "All right," he agreed, "but we'll drive as close as we can. No risks." Lauren nodded, understanding that from now on, everything would be about balancing normalcy with caution. They headed out toward the woods behind the house, Sophie skipping ahead, picking up flowers and rocks like she was on a grand adventure. Luke and Lauren walked side by side, their hands brushing sometimes, maybe by accident, maybe not. The clearing was a small piece of hidden paradise among the trees, with tall grass and wildflowers swaying in the soft breeze. Sophie ran into the middle of the field, spinning until she fell back, laughing at the sky. "She hasn't laughed like that in a long time," Luke said, his voice rough. Lauren looked at him, her eyes full of sadness and gratitude. "Not me either," she whispered. They sat down at the edge of the clearing, watching Sophie play. For the first time in days, Luke let himself relax, letting himself believe, even if just for a moment, that maybe they could build something new here. But the peace shattered when Luke saw something that made him freeze. Footprints, fresh ones, and they weren't theirs. He stood up slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for the small knife he always carried at his waist. "Lauren," he said, his voice low and tense, "get Sophie, now." She didn't question it. Within seconds, Lauren was calling Sophie back, trying to keep her voice light, not to alarm the little girl. Luke studied the footprints, 2, maybe 3 people, who seemed to have circled the clearing. People who shouldn't have been there. By the time Lauren and Sophie reached him, Luke was already on full alert. "Inside," he murmured. "No questions." They rushed back to the truck. Luke kept glancing over his shoulder, his stomach churning. Once inside the house, after locking all the doors, Luke turned to Lauren. "We're not as hidden as you thought." Lauren bit her lip, panic starting to rise in her eyes. "You think they found us?" Luke didn't answer right away, because deep down, he knew. They were running out of time, and the fight they had dreaded was about to begin. Luke locked the last window and pulled the curtains shut, plunging the house into a dim, uneasy darkness. He moved quickly, efficiently, like someone who had been through situations like this before, though deep down, he knew nothing was really like this. Lauren stood by the fireplace, holding Sophie tightly against her chest. The little girl could feel the tension in the air, looking around, confused and scared. Luke approached them. "We need to prepare," he said, his voice low but firm. Lauren nodded, clutching Sophie a little tighter. "Is there another way out?" he asked. Lauren thought for a moment. "There's a back door that leads into the woods," she said. "And a basement. It's small, but it could work if we need to hide." Luke filed the information away quickly. Every detail could mean survival now. He knelt down in front of Sophie, holding her small shoulders gently. "Listen, sweetheart," he said softly. "We're going to play a little game now, okay? You're going to stay really, really quiet and do exactly what me and Mommy say, all right?" Sophie, her big eyes serious, nodded. Lauren looked at Luke, and in that moment, any lingering doubt she had about trusting him vanished. He was their anchor, their safe harbor in the middle of chaos. They spent the next hour getting ready. Luke combed through the house, gathering anything that could be used for defense. An old rusty shotgun he found in Lauren's grandfather's closet, some kitchen knives, pieces of wood to reinforce the doors. Lauren packed a backpack with clothes, important documents, and easy-to-carry food, just in case they had to run. When everything was set, they met back in the living room, the fire now reduced to glowing embers. Luke leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "If they come," he said, "we're not running again." Lauren stared at him, surprised. "We're fighting?" Luke nodded. "This is our home now, our family, and I'm not letting anyone take it from me." His words hung in the air, heavy with a weight Lauren felt deep in her soul. Family. He had said, "Our family." Lauren blinked quickly to fight back the tears threatening to spill. "I should have trusted you from the start," she whispered. Luke shrugged, trying to seem indifferent, but the emotion was clear in his eyes. "Now you can." For a long moment they just looked at each other, two souls marked by life, recognizing in each other the same fear, the same hope, the same stubborn refusal to give up. Then, impulsively, Lauren stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Luke. He stiffened at first, surprised, but then his arms closed around her, holding her tight. It wasn't the kind of hug they used to share, not blind passion, not desperate impulse. It was a silent pact, a wordless promise. When they pulled apart, there was something new between them, something no threat could erase. Luke brushed a hand through Lauren's hair, a quick, almost unconscious gesture, and said, "We're getting through this, together." Lauren smiled, small and confident for the first time in a long while. "Together," she repeated. But neither of them knew that while they were finding strength inside the house, outside, hidden in the darkness of the forest, cold, patient eyes were watching them, and the storm coming their way would be worse than anything they had ever faced before. The house was too quiet. Luke knew that sometimes silence was the biggest warning of all. He paced near the cold fireplace, every fiber of his body stretched tight like a wire about to snap. The old shotgun rested in his hands, loaded and ready. Lauren sat on the couch with Sophie in her lap, whispering soft stories into the little girl's ear to keep her calm. But her eyes followed Luke's every move, as if drawing strength just from seeing him standing there, firm between them and the danger. Then, a noise. Subtle. Outside, near the porch, Luke froze. He raised his hand, signaling for absolute silence. Lauren hugged Sophie tighter, and the little girl seemed to understand. She went completely still, her eyes wide. Luke slid to the nearest window, carefully pulling the curtain back to peek out. The moonlight was faint, but it was enough to reveal a shadow moving between the trees. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't paranoia. They were out there. He went back to Lauren. "Grab the bag," he murmured. "Be ready to run for the basement when I say." Lauren nodded, her jaw clenched tight with tension. Luke positioned himself near the door, the shotgun firm in his arms. His heart hammered in his chest, but his mind stayed cold, focused. Another sound, this time a soft knock, like a hand testing the strength of the back door. Luke moved silently through the house, creeping closer to the back. And then suddenly, a blast. The front door exploded inward with a deafening crash, wood splinters flying into the house. Luke spun on his heels, already moving. "Run!" he shouted to Lauren. She didn't hesitate. Grabbing Sophie, she sprinted toward the door that led to the basement. 3 men in black stormed into the living room, armed, their cold eyes sweeping the room. Luke didn't hesitate. He raised the shotgun and fired at the ground near them, sending up a cloud of dust and debris. It was a warning. This wouldn't be easy. The men backed off for a second, surprised, but quickly regrouped. Luke knew he couldn't win this fight. The goal was to buy time, to protect Lauren and Sophie. He fired again, aiming near the window this time, creating another distraction. "Go!" he shouted again. Lauren shoved Sophie through the small basement door and, with one last glance at Luke, slipped inside behind her daughter, locking it from the other side. Luke felt a wave of relief hearing the latch click shut. Now it was him against them. The men advanced, confident. Luke kicked the nearest chair toward one of them, making him stumble briefly. The fight was brutal. Bodies colliding, furniture breaking, muffled grunts. Luke took a punch to the gut that knocked the air out of him, but he retaliated, slamming the butt of the shotgun into the attacker's shoulder. He didn't need to beat them. He just needed to hold them off. Then, out of nowhere, the roar of an engine outside. Headlights flooded the wrecked living room, making the intruders hesitate. Someone was coming. Luke seized the distraction, shoving one of the men into the wall and sprinting for the basement stairs. "Now!" he yelled. Lauren flung the door open, pulling him inside. They slammed it shut just as another gunshot echoed through the house. Inside the basement, the light was dim, the air thick with the smell of dirt and mildew. Lauren was gasping for breath, her face pale, Sophie clinging to her waist. Luke pressed his forehead against the cold wall, trying to catch his breath. Lauren moved closer, touching his arm. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, then at Sophie, and something inside him locked into place, solid and unbreakable. "As long as you're okay," he murmured. "I'm okay." Lauren let out a small sob, a mix of fear and relief. And in that moment, Luke knew he would do anything to protect them. Anything. Above them, footsteps echoed through the house. They weren't safe yet, but they were together. And that was all that mattered. The basement was small, almost suffocating. The rough stone walls and the low ceiling felt like they were closing in on them, while upstairs, the intruders' footsteps thundered like distant storms. Lauren sat down on the cold floor, pulling Sophie onto her lap. The little girl was trembling, her wide eyes darting around the room, and Lauren held her tight, whispering words of comfort she herself desperately needed to hear. Luke paced back and forth, restless. Every muscle in his body screamed to act, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. He needed a plan. Finally, he stopped in front of them, crouching down to Lauren's level. "We're gonna have to get out of here," he said, his voice firm. "We can't stay trapped down here too long. If they decide to search the basement, we're cornered." Lauren nodded, trying not to let fear take over. "But how?" she whispered. "They're everywhere." Luke ran a hand through his hair, thinking fast. "There's an emergency exit," she said suddenly, the memory flashing like a light. "My grandfather built a tunnel. It starts behind that old bookshelf." Luke followed her gaze to a dusty wooden bookshelf. Without wasting a second, he shoved it aside, revealing a nearly invisible wooden door set into the wall. "It'll take us into the forest," Lauren said. "There's an old trail that comes out a few miles from here." Luke nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "Perfect." He turned to Sophie, kneeling down in front of her. "Listen, princess," he said gently. "We're going to play another game now, okay? A quiet race. Whoever can run the farthest without making a sound wins." Sophie bit her lip but nodded seriously. "Good girl," Luke murmured, brushing her cheek lightly. Lauren watched, her heart tightening. He was so natural with Sophie, so careful. And she had stolen that from them for so long. A wave of guilt and love flooded her suddenly. Before they could move, Lauren grabbed the sleeve of Luke's shirt. He looked at her, surprised. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for not giving up on us, even after everything." Luke stayed silent for a moment, studying her face in the faint light. "I tried," he admitted, his voice rough. tried to forget, tried to move on. Lauren closed her eyes, pain tearing through her chest. "But I couldn't," he continued, his voice breaking. "Because you were everything to me." The silence between them was heavy with unspoken things, lost love, hurt, hope. Without thinking, Lauren leaned in and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek, a simple gesture, but full of emotion. Luke closed his eyes for a second, as if her touch was a balm for every wound he carried. When he opened them again, there was something different in his gaze, a silent promise. He touched her hand briefly, squeezing it in response. "We're getting out of this," he murmured. "And then, we'll see what else we can be." Lauren smiled through her tears, and for the first time since all of this began, she truly believed it. Luke stood, adjusting the backpack on his shoulders. "Time for the race," he said, winking at Sophie. The little girl gave a shy smile and held tightly to her mother's hand. Together, they opened the door to the tunnel. The cold, damp air of the passage wrapped around them, and silently, the three of them disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind the house that had been their shelter, and that was now a trap. The world outside was dangerous, but together they were stronger than any enemy could ever imagine. The tunnel was narrow, dark, and damp. The dirt floor muffled their steps, while the wooden walls creaked softly under the weight of the years. Luke led the way, his firm hand holding a small flashlight that barely lit the path ahead. Lauren followed close behind, clutching Sophie tightly to her chest, feeling her heart race faster with every tiny sound. Fear was a physical presence down there, squeezing her lungs, rushing hot through her veins. But Luke's hand was steady, and Lauren clung to that like a life raft in the middle of a storm. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a small wooden door at the end of the tunnel. Luke stopped, signaling for silence. He switched off the flashlight and pressed his ear to the door. Nothing. Still, he waited a few more seconds, his whole body tense and ready. Then, carefully, he pushed the door open. Fresh forest air rushed in immediately. Outside, the night was dark, the tree canopy forming a thick ceiling that blocked most of the moonlight. Luke stepped out first, scanning the surroundings. Once he was sure it was clear, he waved Lauren and Sophie forward. They emerged from the tunnel like shadows and slipped into the forest. The ground was wet from the previous day's rain, making the walk hard. Low branches scratched at their clothes, and hidden roots threatened to trip them with every step. Luke kept the pace fast but careful, quick enough to gain ground, slow enough to stay quiet. Every now and then, he glanced back, checking on Lauren and Sophie. And every time he saw Lauren's hand holding Sophie's tight, her face set with determination, despite her fear. Something warm and fiercely protective flared inside him. They were a unit now. A small family, fighting against the world. Sophie stumbled over a root and fell to her knees with a small whimper. Before she could start crying, Lauren knelt beside her. "Shh, sweetheart. It's okay. Just a little fall," she whispered, her voice full of a calm she didn't really feel. Luke crouched down too, quickly checking the girl's leg. "No blood, just some scratches," he said. Sophie sniffled, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her shirt. Luke gave a small smile and reached out his hand. "Want to ride on my back, princess?" Sophie's eyes lit up through her tears. She nodded shyly. With quick, practiced movements, Luke hoisted her onto his back, holding her legs firmly. "Hold on tight, okay?" Sophie wrapped her little arms around his neck, pressing herself against him. Lauren watched, her heart tightening. Luke wasn't just a protector. He was the home she and Sophie needed. They moved through the forest, the constant tension pushing them forward. Luke knew the feeling of being hunted all too well. The oppressive silence, the sense of invisible eyes tracking every step. And he knew. They weren't as far ahead as they wanted to believe. After half an hour of tense walking, they reached a creek. Luke stopped at the edge and looked at Lauren. "If we cross here, it'll break our trail," he explained in a low voice. Lauren nodded, trusting him blindly now. They stepped into the icy water, gasping softly at the cold, and moved along the creek for a few minutes, letting the current wash away any trace of their passing. Finally, Luke guided them out of the water farther upstream. They were soaked, shivering, and exhausted. Luke spotted a rocky formation ahead, a small cave hidden among the trees. "We'll take shelter there," he said. They crossed the final stretch, almost running. Inside the small cave, the cold wasn't as cutting, and the feeling of safety, illusory as it might be, was enough to let them relax for a moment. Luke gently set Sophie down, pulled off her wet jacket, and wrapped her up in Lauren's arms. Sophie was asleep again within minutes, completely drained. Lauren looked at Luke, tears of gratitude brimming in her eyes. He smiled, a tired but genuine smile. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, listening only to the distant murmur of the creek and Sophie's soft breathing. Lauren tugged on Luke's jacket, making him look at her. "I couldn't have done this without you," she whispered. Luke just shook his head. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You always were." Lauren smiled, a small, broken smile, but real. And as the night stretched on outside, full of unseen dangers, inside that small cave, 3 hearts beat in the same rhythm. Together. Finally together. And this time, none of them planned to let go. The darkness outside the cave was thick, almost solid, but inside, a different fire burned in Luke and Lauren's eyes. They were tired, soaked, hungry, but not defeated. Sophie slept peacefully, tucked under Luke's jacket and Lauren's protective embrace. Seeing her daughter safe, even if only for a fragile moment, gave Lauren a strength she didn't even know she still had. Luke was mentally mapping the area, the trails, the clearings, the old paths. They had few advantages, but they had to use them. He turned to Lauren, who was watching Sophie with eyes full of tenderness and worry. "We can't keep running," he said in a low voice, careful not to wake the little girl. "They've got more men, more training, better gear." Lauren looked at him, fear pulsing under her skin. "So, what do we do?" Luke adjusted the old shotgun beside him and crossed his arms. "We stop running," he said. "We fight." Lauren frowned. "But how? We don't have weapons. We don't have allies. It's just us." Luke gave a sideways grin, that stubborn, determined grin she remembered loving years ago. "We've got more than they think," he replied. "They think we're weak. They think we're just a scared mom, a makeshift dad, and a helpless kid." Lauren tilted her head, curious. And that makes us unpredictable." He moved closer to her, lowering his voice even more. "I know men like them, Lauren. Trained to hunt, to intimidate, but not to fight someone who's got nothing left to lose." Lauren swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. They really didn't have anything left to lose, except each other. Luke continued, his mind already racing. "There's an old watchtower about 1 kilometer from here. My grandpa took me there once when I was a kid. Hardly anyone even remembers it's there. If we can get there before dawn, we can set a trap." Lauren blinked, surprised. "A trap?" Luke nodded. "We'll make them think they've cornered us, and then we turn the tables." Lauren looked at Sophie, sleeping so innocently, completely unaware of the storm unraveling around her. "It's risky," she murmured. "It's our best shot," Luke said firmly, "and I promise I won't let anything happen to you." Lauren looked at him for a long moment. She saw the unbreakable determination in his eyes, the silent strength that had been holding them up from the beginning, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in something again, to believe in him. She nodded. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." Luke smiled, that rare smile that warmed more than any fire. He reached out his hand. Lauren hesitated for half a second, then placed hers in his. The grip was firm, a silent promise. They were partners now, not just surviving together, but fighting together. Luke leaned in slightly, his voice dropping even lower, more intimate. "Do you trust me?" Lauren didn't hesitate. "With my life." And for the first time that night, fear gave way to something else, something vibrating quietly between them. Something no chase, no enemy could ever steal. Faith. In Luke, in Lauren, in them. He squeezed her hand one last time before letting go. "Let's bring this home." Lauren smiled, a small smile but full of fire. "Let's." They got ready in silence, packing the small bag, adjusting Sophie in Lauren's arms. Before leaving the cave, Luke paused and looked at them. He knew. From this moment on, It wasn't just about running. It was about fighting. For freedom. For family. For the love that was only just beginning to bloom, even in the middle of chaos. The forest felt different now. It wasn't just the invisible danger lurking between the trees. It was the sense of purpose burning in Luke's and Lauren's chests. They walked in silence, Sophie nestled against Lauren, protected from the chill of the early morning. Luke led the way, senses on full alert. At every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch, he stopped, listened, assessed. The whole world seemed suspended on an invisible thread of tension, ready to snap. They needed to reach the tower before the sky began to lighten. The old trail climbed slowly, winding through dense hills of ancient trees. It was hard to see more than a few meters ahead, with low fog curling around their ankles like cold fingers. At one point, Lauren stumbled over a hidden root and nearly fell. Luke was at her side in a second, catching her by the waist. She gasped, her body pressed against his. For a moment that felt much longer than it really was. They stayed like that, too close, feeling each other's warm breath in the cold forest air. Lauren's eyes slowly rose to meet his. The world around them disappeared. There were no footsteps in the woods, no hunters behind them. There was only the two of them, and everything they hadn't yet said. Luke lifted a hand and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his fingers grazing the cold skin of her cheek. Lauren closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel. The tension between them was electric, alive. Luke leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. When their faces were just inches apart, a distant shout tore through the air, a sharp, angry sound. They pulled apart immediately, their hearts pounding not just from the tension, but from the real danger closing in. Luke grabbed Lauren's arm, firm but gentle. "Let's go," he murmured, his voice rough. Lauren simply nodded, pulling Sophie closer. They continued up the hill, faster, more alert. The tower appeared ahead soon after, an old wooden structure partially hidden among twisted trees and covered in moss. It looked like it might collapse at any second, but it still stood tall, a forgotten sentinel from the past. Luke quickly inspected the place. The main entrance was intact, and inside there were several staircases and a platform at the top, perfect for watching without being seen. He turned back to Lauren. "Come up with me, quickly." They climbed the creaky stairs, careful not to make a sound. Sophie, ever obedient, pressed her lips together to stay quiet. At the top, the world opened up around them. The vast forest, wrapped in mist, looked like an endless sea of shadows and possibilities. Luke scanned the area around them, mentally planning every step. "We're gonna lure them up here," he explained, keeping his voice low. "Make them think they've cornered us at the top." Lauren frowned. "And then?" Luke flashed that quick, determined smile. "And then we bring the tower down." Lauren blinked, surprised. "What?" "It's old," he said, tapping lightly on one of the support beams. "We can weaken the structure. With the extra weight of 3 or 4 men rushing up, it'll collapse." Lauren swallowed hard, adrenaline spiking. "That's dangerous." "It's our best shot." They worked fast, using the improvised tools Luke had packed in his bag. A small hunting knife, some ropes, and pure instinct. While Luke carefully sawed at the main support beams at the base, Lauren kept watch, Sophie sitting close beside her, clutching her teddy bear. The whole time, Luke could feel Lauren's eyes on him, warm, protective, full of silent faith. And for the first time, he felt something like hope spark in his chest. They still had a chance. Not just to survive, but to start over. The sun still hadn't risen, but the forest around them seemed to be waking up. Luke was finishing the last cuts on the weakened beams, his hands steady despite the tension vibrating under his skin. Lauren watched from the top platform. Sophie nestled in her arms, trying hard not to let the fear show on her face. Then, they heard it. The sound of hurried footsteps crunching branches, muffled voices, urgent. They had been found. Luke sprinted up the old stairs 2 at a time, reaching Lauren's side. "They're coming," he said, voice low and controlled. Lauren nodded, her face pale but determined. Sophie, sensing the change in the air, clung tighter to her mother. "It's gonna be okay, sweetheart," Lauren whispered into her ear. Luke peered over the side of the platform. Between the trees, he saw the first man emerge, then another, and another. 3 men, all armed, sweeping the area with predatory eyes. They spoke to each other in short, decisive commands. "There," one of them shouted, pointing at the tower. Luke took a deep breath. It was starting. The men approached quickly, unaware they were walking right into Luke's plan. The first man began climbing the stairs, his heavy steps making the old structure groan in protest. The second followed close behind. The third stayed on the ground, covering them. Luke grabbed Lauren's hand. "Now," he murmured. Lauren held her breath, clutching Sophie tightly. The first man was halfway up when Luke yanked on one of the ropes he had prepared. The beams, already weakened and sliced, began to give with a loud crack. The 2 men on the stairs froze for a split second, realizing too late. The whole tower creaked violently. "Hold on!" Luke shouted, pulling Lauren and Sophie to the safest corner of the platform. With a deafening crash, the staircase snapped and collapsed, along with half the support structure. The 2 men fell with it, tumbling down in a cloud of wood splinters and dust. The third man on the ground stumbled back instinctively, shielding his face from the debris. Luke seized the distraction. "Go!" he shouted, scooping Sophie into his arms. Lauren ran beside him as they bolted down the part of the tower that still stood, jumping off the last step onto the ground. The impact rattled their bones, but they didn't stop. The third man, realizing they were fleeing, drew his gun. A shot cracked through the air, whizzing close. Lauren gasped, but kept running. Luke twisted mid-run, pulled the small hunting knife from his belt, and threw it with precise aim. The blade sank into the man's shoulder, making him cry out and drop his weapon. Without pausing to see the full effect, Luke turned and ran. They plunged into the dense forest, the sounds of the wounded men fading behind them. Finally, after reaching a safe distance, Luke stopped, panting hard, and turned to Lauren. She was bent over, trying to catch her breath, but she smiled at him, a tired, victorious smile. "You're completely insane," she said between gasps. Luke gave a sideways grin, pulling Sophie closer. "Maybe," he said. "But it worked." Lauren laughed, the sound broken but full of relief. And then, without thinking, without hesitating, she threw herself into his arms. Luke held her tightly, burying his face in her neck, inhaling her scent. Earth, sweat, and something that was purely Lauren. They stayed like that for a moment, their hearts pounding out of sync, life pulsing through them with renewed strength. Finally, Lauren pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "Thank you," she murmured. Luke smiled, a small smile, but one full of promises. "Told you," he said. "I'm not leaving you." Lauren bit her lip, hesitating. Then, very slowly, she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was a brief kiss, loaded with everything they couldn't put into words: fear, relief, hope. When they pulled apart, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "This is just the beginning," he promised. Lauren smiled. "I know." Sophie, sensing the relief in the air, giggled softly, breaking the moment. Luke scooped the little girl into his arms, and hand in hand with Lauren, they started walking again through the forest. They weren't completely safe yet, but for the first time in a long time, they were together. And that was everything. The sky was starting to lighten, tinting the forest in soft shades of blue and gold. Luke, Lauren, and Sophie moved through the trees, each step driven not just by the need to survive, but by something bigger, the promise of a new life together. They needed to reach the main road, where Luke hoped to meet an old contact, someone who owed him a favor, someone who could make sure Lauren and Sophie disappeared for real this time, the right way. The forest's silence was broken only by the sound of their quick steps, but Luke knew they weren't out of danger yet. The men in black, the ones still able to move, wouldn't give up so easily. And he was right. When they could already see the road through the trees, a black pickup truck suddenly skidded into view, blocking their way. Simon. He climbed out of the vehicle with the calm arrogance of someone who thought he had already won. His right arm was strapped in a makeshift sling, his face smeared with dirt and dried blood. "You're tougher than I expected," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Luke pushed Sophie behind Lauren and took a step forward. "Last chance, Simon," he said, his voice low and deadly. "Walk away. Simon let out a dry laugh, pulling a gun from his waistband. "You think this is a game? You think you can beat me?" He pointed at Lauren. "She belongs to us. Always has." Lauren's stomach churned, but she stood firm. "Not anymore," she said. Simon smiled, cruel. "You really think he can save you? A small-town nobody?" Luke didn't answer. He just moved. In a swift motion, he pulled a small pistol from his backpack, the one an old farmer had given him years ago, back when the running first started. Simon hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that was all Luke needed. He fired. The bullet struck the ground inches from Simon's feet, making him stumble back, startled. "I don't want to kill you," Luke said, his voice like steel. "But if you touch her or my daughter again, I won't think twice." Simon's eyes widened, realizing he had lost. Behind them, the sound of approaching engines. Luke's contact's truck barreled into view, kicking up dust. Two men jumped out quickly, ex-cops, ex-military. Men who knew how to deal with predators like Simon. Within minutes, Simon was cuffed on the ground, being hauled into the truck. Lauren watched in silence, her whole body trembling. Luke turned to her, moving fast, his eyes full of concern. "It's over," he said, stopping in front of her. Lauren shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It's over," she repeated, like she needed to hear it to believe it. Luke pulled her into his arms, hugging her tight. Sophie wedged herself between them, and for the first time, Luke embraced them both. The woman he had never stopped loving, and the daughter he now knew was wholly his. The sun rose a little higher, bathing the road in golden light. They were free. Truly free. As the men drove Simon away, Luke, Lauren, and Sophie stood there, holding on to each other, letting the new day wash over their old wounds. They knew there was still a lot to rebuild, that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. But for the first time, they were ready to move forward, together. Luke looked at Lauren, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. "And now?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Lauren smiled, her expression full of hope. "Now, we start over." Luke leaned in and kissed her, a kiss full of promises, forgiveness, and love. Sophie giggled softly and clung to his leg. Luke laughed against Lauren's lips. "Starting over sounds perfect," he said. And with Sophie between them, holding hands, they began walking down the road, not as fugitives, but as a family. Finally, 6 months later, the afternoon sun bathed the fields around the small farm in golden light. The distant sound of horses, the scent of freshly turned soil, and the laughter of a child filled the air. Luke was crouched near the barn, fixing the fence that bordered the newly planted orchard. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up to his elbows, his face calm, but always alert. He looked up when he heard light footsteps on the porch. Lauren. She walked slowly, balancing a basket of clean laundry on her hip, her hair loosely tied back, her face lit up by a peaceful smile. And right behind her, barefoot and laughing loudly, came Sophie, her cheeks rosy and her eyes shining with life. Luke dropped his tools and walked toward them, unhurried, as if every step was a piece of the happiness he now allowed himself to live. Lauren smiled as she saw him approach. "You ever stop working?" she teased, setting the basket down on the porch. Luke shrugged, smiling sideways. "I'm still getting used to the idea that we actually made it," he said, looking around, taking it all in. Lauren stepped closer and wrapped her arms around his waist. "You brought us here," she whispered, resting her forehead against his chest. Luke kissed the top of her head. "We brought us here." Sophie ran up to them, grabbing onto Luke's leg tightly. "Daddy," she said, laughing. Luke crouched down and scooped her into his arms, spinning her around as she squealed with delight. "Daddy." The word still squeezed his heart every time he heard it. Lauren watched the scene with tears in her eyes, good tears this time. They had fought so hard, lost so much, and in the end found something better than anything they could have ever dreamed of: family. After Sophie calmed down, they all sat together on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Lauren rested her head on Luke's shoulder. "Do you think we'll ever stop looking back?" she asked quietly. Luke was silent for a moment, thinking. "Maybe," he said finally. "But even if we don't, I think we have a lot more to look forward to now." Lauren smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "And I wouldn't change a thing," she said. Sophie curled up between them, yawning. Luke pulled her into his lap, feeling the small, comforting weight of her against his chest. "Neither would I," he murmured. The sky slowly darkened, the first stars beginning to blink into existence on the horizon. And there, on that little piece of the world they had fought for with sweat, pain, and love, Luke, Lauren, and Sophie found what they had been searching for all their lives: peace, family, a home. And as the stars shone down on them, Luke knew, for the first time in a very, very long time, that they were exactly where they were meant to be, finally.